So it seems like anytime a discussion on quote-unquote bad comic book movies happens, it seems like Spider-Man 3 creeps its way in there. And I think this is a highly debated movie because you have the flip side of that. Really because of, the third chapter in a very beloved trilogy. A movie that introduces probably one of the most popular villains in the Marvel Universe, Venom. And just looking at the movie, it looks like one of the biggest budget comic book movies ever. I don't know exactly what the budget was for this movie, but it looks huge. It feels huge, more importantly. All said and done, this gets lumped into the bad more than the good. So, I want you to hear me out on Spider-Man 3. Let's go. Spider-Man 3 stars Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, James Franco, Topher Grace, Bryce Dallas Howard, and is directed by Sam Raimi. What's up, guys? I love doing my Hear Me Out series. I've done the RoboCop remake. I've done Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I believe this is my third one. And it's just a random thing. Like if I get into a discussion about a movie, and in this case, Spider-Man No Way Home is coming out, and anytime there's a new Spider-Man movie coming out, somehow Spider-Man 3 gets its way into the conversation. And I thought, you know what? I've been constantly defending this movie. I don't think it's perfect, but I think the good far outweighs the bad. And I thought this would be a fun movie, given the timing. Spider-Man No Way Home. By the way, people, if you are paying $10,000, $25,000 for a ticket opening night, then you have more money than me, I guess. And that's just insane. That's balls crazy. And this is a movie I've always wanted to talk about. I haven't reviewed all of the Spider-Man movies. I'm not the type of reviewer that likes to do franchises in order, or just properties in order like Spider-Man. I'm more impulsive, and if I'm thinking about something like I was with Amazing Spider-Man 2, then I feel like I need to hop in the chair and I need to talk about it. So Spider-Man 3, so looking forward to getting into this one and what makes it tick and all the controversy around the movie. Emo Parker, the Venom that feels like it's tacked on. Topher Grace's performance that 99% of the time people are going to say it's complete crap. They don't like him as the character. I might surprise you a little bit with my take on Topher Grace. We'll get to that. Spider-Man 3 composer. I literally had to look that up because I was going to say Danny Elfman, because this sounds and feels like a Danny Elfman score, although Christopher Young is actually taking work that was previously done by Elfman. But again, just from the instruments, from the sounds, everything, it feels like a Danny Elfman score. But Christopher Young, there's a lot of variety in this score. Every character has their own little theme. The reason I'm talking about this now is because the Raimi films are known for their iconic intros, and that, that I get to show off a little bit of my drum skills. It's something like that. I always like that little percussive cadence at the beginning of any Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, and I think that's what sets it apart amongst the web movies and this new MCU incarnation, which I don't really care for. As a matter of fact, I just watched Homecoming again. This is probably the 4th or 5th time I've seen it. Every time I don't like the movie, and I like it less every time I watch it. And I'm probably going to be comparing Homecoming from time to time with this movie and really just the Raimi movies. How that movie and the MCU in general gets a pass, it seems like it, whereas movies like this get lambasted for the exact same reasons. We'll get into Emo Parker. But also this third movie, I believe at the time this was going to be the final movie, even though they talked about a 4th Raimi movie after this. This movie did make a lot of money. But it had to wrap up a lot of loose ends. One thing I love about the Raimi trilogy is it all feels like one continuous story, and I think a big part of that is just the relationships there between Peter Parker and MJ and Harry. Harry, James Franco, is an integral part to this. He's just as important as Peter Parker is throughout this whole thing. You don't see that type of stuff, that strongly imprinted into the fabric of the story like you do with these Sam Raimi movies. By this time, we couldn't imagine anybody else as Spider-Man except for Tobey Maguire. He really just embodied the role. He had a good mix of the nerdy Peter Parker, as well as, because of his physique, you could buy him as this superhero. And I think that's why Tobey is probably most people's favorite Spider-Man. Arguably. There are some people, like I'll even say, I think Andrew Garfield's the better Spider-Man, and I think Tobey is the better Peter Parker. Nothing against Tom Holland, but I put those two above him, even on Andrew Garfield. Check out my Amazing Spider-Man 2 review. I talk a lot about Andrew Garfield in that. But that's another movie I think that's highly underrated. The way to tie that into this is the emotional core, the emotional depth, which is something that I feel like is lacking in these later MCU movies. I even posted on Twitter, it feels like Marvel, as soon as they got a hold of Spider-Man, that whole Homecoming movie felt like, ooh, we're cool now. We got Spider-Man. Look what we got. And so let's lather this story with that MCU comedic formula. I'd even say that there's more tongue-in-cheek comedic flair to Homecoming than most of the MCU movies. And they're all known for their comedy, but this one, it felt like they were flexing a little bit. It felt like the story was taking more of a back seat to the MCU style. Yeah, granted, there's a story there, but I felt like the characters were a lot weaker than what we got in the Raimi trilogy. But I think Spider-Man 3 delivers what it promises. That relationship between Peter and Harry is so strong and so intense by the end of 2, and it carries over even more so into this movie. You have this amazing fight sequence. By the way, the action sequences in this movie, I think, could be some of the best out of the entire Spider-Man run. They're insane. It starts off with Spidey going through the New York skyscrapers. Sam Raimi had a way of making you feel like you were there with Spidey. And just the scale of these, the skyline of New York with Spider-Man flying through it, that's something that I don't feel like we get with these newer movies. But Raimi just freaking killed, and it just adds to the realism of the movie. I'd rather have that than Peter Parker running across suburban rooftops. But yeah, you got this big fight, Harry and Peter, which is kind of cool too, because Peter, he's not even in his Spider-Man getup. He's in his little suit because he went to go check out MJ, her performance. But there's that anger and that hatred. Hatred, that's a theme throughout this movie, and hatred causes all these horrible things to happen. But Harry gets messed up really bad. So bad that he has to go to the hospital. He has amnesia, and that is a thread throughout the rest of the movie. How do we get away with this anger that Harry has towards Peter quickly? We give him amnesia, so he doesn't remember anything. All he remembers is the love that he had for his friends, not the anger that he had, that rage that he feels because of the death of his father. So later in the movie, when he realizes that Peter, in his mind, is responsible for the death of his father, it makes it that much more impactful. Also, Peter and MJ, there's a real struggle with their relationship. If you remember, they were having some really rough times in the last movie because to protect her, Peter pushed her away. And she convinces him to, hey, let's try to make this happen. And so in this movie, a big part of this is, how do you compete with Spider-Man? How do you compete with what Peter Parker is? You know the secret, and you know how popular he is with the people of New York. And Peter has blinders on to that. This is a Spider-Man movie where Peter buys into his own hype, and that kind of leads into what becomes Emo Parker. And I know you're going to say that, it's the symbiote. I think the symbiote is more symbolic of the road that he was going down anyway. If you watch, before he even is taken over by the symbiote, he's already starting to be really arrogant. And he constantly brings up these comparisons. Like, I can relate to what you're going through, MJ. I constantly hear people say, Spider-Man, Spider-Man, Spider-Man. And it's annoying. And she calls him on that, So their relationship is more strained than ever. And I do like how it was handled, because there was a time where I found myself annoyed with MJ in this movie. But after watching it again last night, I kind of saw everything through her eyes. You know, what would I feel like had I been going through the same things that she was going through, having to compete with Spider-Man? Of course you'd be kind of bent out of shape about it, and you'd probably be a Debbie Downer. And so I love how it comes full circle at the end. And it's not when Peter has to save her. This is one of the problems, of course. He constantly has to save MJ at the end of every movie. But it's not immediately her hugging him and them reconciling. Yes, that's at the very end, which kind of feels tacked on. Like, I almost wish this movie would have left that last scene in the bar out, you know, and just left it cold and unsure of what the future would hold with Peter and MJ. I think that would have been a more impactful ending, actually. Okay, let's get into the fun stuff. Let's get into the stuff that I know gets the most attention out of this movie for the negative reasons, that being the Emo Parker and eventually Venom. Going into this is something that I always wanted, that most of the fans wanted. I want a Spider-Man Venom movie. To do so properly, at least with this storyline, having Peter get the symbiote, become the black costume Spider-Man, and eventually the symbiote getting off of him, which, by the way, that freaking scene in the church with the bell, it's right out of the comics, and man, it is just one of the most visually striking scenes out of the whole Spider-Man catalog. I think this should have been 2 movies. I'll go ahead and admit that right now. Even though I'm here defending this movie, yes, I've always thought that Spider-Man 3 should have been Spider-Man 3A and 3B. Because I think the first movie should have been him getting the black costume. And then I think the end of that movie should have been Eddie Brock becoming Venom. And then you could have done a whole movie with Venom. So yes, Venom is tacked on at the end of this movie. But before we get to Venom, this is the part that is the most divisive amongst fans, the emo Peter. And it's definitely an amplified version of what would probably happen. You know, we know before he even gets the symbiote, like I said, he starts getting arrogant, he starts getting cocky. And so once he becomes the black costume, he pretty much becomes like a bad version. You know, like everybody has a dark side and a light side. The dark side takes over. The ego takes over. And Peter thinks he's invincible, thinks he can take on anyone. And he is quick to react. That's the big thing here that you gotta latch onto. He doesn't stop and think about the context of any situation. He immediately just pounces on whatever. He's so angry about the death of his uncle. And we find out that Flint Marko was actually responsible, was the guy that actually killed Uncle Ben. But Peter didn't take into account the context of the situation, that this was a guy trying to get money for his daughter because she was sick. By the way, those musical beats by Christopher Young are some of the best stuff out of this movie. Those light, tender moments. You know, you really felt for Flint Marko in Spider-Man 3. I think it's what makes him such a memorable character, and you could have really had your own movie with Flint Marko. People are going to bitch about this movie having 3 villains, but they can't wait for Spider-Man No Way Home, which is going to have 27 different characters in the movie. But that's great, right? Because it's the MCU, and MCU gets a pass. That's unfair, okay? But I'm just saying, fandom is such a funny thing. It really is. And in this day and age, you can't have a comic book movie without at least 5 different characters in the movie, good or bad. So by today's standards, Spider-Man 3, pretty tame stuff as far as like quantity of characters. But jumping back on Sandman, you know, that sequence when he first becomes Sandman and the sand pebbles, that is a sequence that took them, I think, 3 years to finally finish, you know, and you could tell the work is right there on the screen. You can tell like every little sand pebble, and the camera pulls back and just, you know, adding some emotion to the whole thing with Flint Marko realizing, you know, I just pretty much died, but I became this monster, this creature. So that just like adds to the confusion and the anger. Again, big theme of this movie. Everybody is dealing with anger. Peter is dealing with anger. Harry is dealing with anger. Flint Marko, anger. But the fight on the train, when Sandman is first presented, he feels invincible. Like, how are you going to beat this guy? But black costume Spider-Man is so sure of himself that once they fight, you buy it. You know, because he's smart, even though he's the ego side of Spider-Man, he's still very smart. And sometimes that anger can actually remove the clouds from your judgment in terms of like fighting. And so the train scene is just really awesome. It's intense. It's very well choreographed. Great stuff. Now let's talk about emo Peter Parker, the thing that everybody loves to make fun of. You can compare that to the current comedic tone of, let's just say, a lot of Marvel movies these days. They opt to go for the corny, the quirky, just so they can get that laugh. And if that happened today, I think it would get a pass. I'm being completely honest. And I think that moment when, he's so cocky and, got that great montage going on, it still fits in with the vibe of the movie, the character. It doesn't stray away from that at all. This is who the character is. And so why not have a little fun? Because this is some pretty dark stuff at this point in the movie. So if you remove all that, then it just stays dark all the way through. Might work. But the emo Peter Parker stuff makes the movie even more memorable, And I think that stuff's going to stay around for a long time. I mean, it's probably one of the most popular Spider-Man gifts out there. That doesn't make for a great decision, but I have a good time with the emo Peter Parker scenes. I still laugh. Last night when I watched the movie, I was having a ball with it. It's just really fun. It's a great moment to take a breath amongst all this seriousness that's going on. And then it jumps right back, right after that scene. He's having this freaking knockdown, drag-out fight with Harry. And this is where Harry gets half of his face burn off. Now let's jump over to the Venom stuff. And this is where I'm definitely going to probably lose some of you. It gets controversial here, but cards on the table. If you watched my review for Venom Let There Be Carnage, I did not like that movie at all. I almost hated it for a lot of reasons. You can check out that review and you can see why I didn't like it. But ultimately, I don't like this version of Venom. I think it was charming in the first Venom movie with Venom and Eddie having this back and forth. But I felt like they removed the mystique of the character, the thing that always drew me into Venom. Because Venom, to me, is kind of a scary character. I mean, he literally will eat people. Even though he felt tacked on in this movie, if you ask me which version of the character I like more thematically, I'm sorry, I go with the Spider-Man 3 version. I felt like Venom was pretty damn creepy and scary. Topher Grace, I think he gets a really bad rap. I can compare this to Jared Leto's Joker. He doesn't really get that much screen time as the character of Joker. Same thing here. He's really at the end of the movie is when he becomes Venom. I think Topher Grace deserved more of a fair shake at the character. His performance throughout the movie as Eddie Brock is passable to good. I bought this guy that seemed like he couldn't get a break. And Peter was more the cocky one here, right? So you can actually look and see things from Eddie Brock's point of view in this movie. Yeah, he was definitely mischievous with his decisions and trying to shortcut his way to getting a job at the Daily Bugle. Yeah, not the best guy. But you can see why by the time he gets to that church and he says, I just want Peter Parker dead. You can kind of see where that's coming from. You can see why he hates Peter Parker. Peter Parker humiliated him. Of course, he deserved it. He earned it. But this was when Peter Parker was, Emo Parker. I like seeing the dark side of Peter Parker. I do, because it raises these questions like, wait, I'm supposed to be rooting for this guy and this guy's supposed to be the bad guy. But Peter Parker was clearly not the good guy by this point in the movie, So when you shake things up with him and Eddie Brock, you would think because they're both kind of bad, they would team up with each other. But no, they hated each other. And so it created for some great drama. And there's a scene when he becomes Venom, the big fight at the end of the movie, which again is glorious. I mean, wow, what a great action set piece. He jumps from the cab onto Spider-Man's chest and he goes, I am going to humiliate you like you humiliated me. That line really stuck with me. And I think Topher Grace did a great job with the character because art imitating life, if you look at Topher Grace's career outside of this, if you look at his previous job in that 70s show, he was the outsider in that show. You know, there was this clique and Topher Grace just didn't fit in, you know? And so when he left that show, there was this like friction, this tension between him and the rest of the cast. And so I felt a little bit of truth coming from Topher Grace's point of view in that line. And I liked it. I really did, you know, and it's not something I really thought about that much because Topher Grace has gotten so much shit over and over and over again for the character, but I kind of feel for the guy. And after watching the movie again, I kind of liked his performance. I did. And that's going to get me all the dislikes, but you won't be able to see them. Thanks, YouTube. So guys, at the end of the day, not only do I really love Spider-Man 3, it's probably my second favorite out of the Raimi trilogy. I prefer it over the first movie. I might prefer it as much as Spider-Man 2. And that's a movie that's like, you know, 10 Commandments of superhero movies. It's still considered one of the greatest superhero movies of all time, and I'm not taking that away from it. But I think Spider-Man 3, if you put the two movies together, I think they fit together better than Spider-Man 1 and 2, if that makes sense. And I love how they pretty much answered every question. They tied up every loose end with the trilogy. And one thing that the Raimi trilogy does, especially in Spider-Man 3, that this new incarnation doesn't, is it really foot stomps emotion. You know, I feel like Spider-Man 2 was more about confusion, and Spider-Man 3 was more about anger and rage. And a lot of us can relate to that, you know? So I'm giving Spider-Man 3 a purchase worthy. I've always loved this movie. I saw it opening night when I was stationed in Japan. It was kind of cool too, watching in the theater, and they had subtitles on the screen. Yeah, I will always stand by that movie, and I'm glad I did a hear me out for it, and I'm really, really looking forward to No Way Home. I think the main reason, or one of the main reasons this movie is so big and so hyped is because of Tobey Maguire, that it's highly likely that he's going to be in No Way Home. I don't think this movie would be getting the buzz that it's getting if not for Andrew Garfield, but especially Tobey Maguire. So anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts on Spider-Man 3. I hope I kind of steered you in my direction on this movie. If you hated it, maybe you give it another watch. Also, be sure to come over to Killer Flicks, where we talk horror all day and every day. And on Fridays, we do Free for Fridays. Follow me at Drumdums on my socials. Support me on Patreon. Buy me a coffee. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Drumdum out.